Let me welcome everyone to this event that is joined from the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies at UT Austin, and the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. I want to welcome all of you and let you know that we are recording this event. So if you are here, you are agreeing to the recording. We will have Javier Auchero hosting this event. He's the director of the Lozano Institute of Latin American Studies at UT Austin, and I'm going to leave him to lead this event. Thank you, Javier.
Thank you, Vicky. It's really a pleasure to be here for the sort of book launching of the Politics of Institutional Weakness. We're going to go in this order, as far as I know. I will introduce Vicky, and then Alicia, Mala, and Eduardo will talk, Aníbal will comment, and then we'll be opening to Q&A. So most of you, all of you, I assume, know who Vicky Murillo is. She's professor of political science and international affairs and director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. She recently published Non-Policy Politics, Richer Voter, Poor Voter, and the Diversification of Parties' Electoral Strategies. I thought it was Rich Dad, Poor Dad for a second. I was like, this is self-help book. But anyway, that is co-author with Ernesto Calvo. Vicky, take it from here. And unmute yourself, Vicky.
So this is the book we're here for to present. I don't know if this is seen with the, yes, with the background. The book is called The Politics of Institutional Weakness in Latin America. And first of all, on behalf of my co-editors, Dan Brinks and Steve Levitsky, and myself, we want to thank the ILAS, the David Rockefeller, and the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, who funded the two original conferences from which this book emerged. And of course, we also want to thank Cambridge University Press, which is, we published the book, and especially Sarah Dosto, who was the editor. This book, as I said, is the product of two conferences with the authors of the chapters of the book. And the conferences allow us as editors to really enrich ourselves and develop a new typology of institutional weakness and the discussion about the conditions that shape political strategies leading to the emergence of weak institutions. The main takeaway point is that weak institutions do not result from mistakes or lack of knowledge from political actors, but are explicitly political strategies to kind of deal with power differentials. The participants in the conference produce a fantastic collection. We will hear today from the chapters of Alicia Holland, Htun, and Eduardo Dargent. But there are other chapters by Ernesto Calvo and Gabriel Negreto, Mike Albertus and Victor Menaldo, Belén Fernández and Candelaria Garay, Maria Paula Zafón and Juan González, Julia Faletti and Andrew Schrank. The typology that we define is really emphasize three dimensions of weakness. The first one is ambition, that is how much the rules do change the status quo, with the argument that there are institutions that do not produce any change in behavior. These are symbolic institutions, like the Potemkin courts that done studies. The second dimension is compliance, and we divide compliance into three different, if you want, categories. The first is non-enforcement, when the state authorities choose not to enforce the rules. And those could be because the institution is what we call window dressing, that it has never had the intention of enforcing the rules, and it was just trying to play to a domestic or international audience. The second one is forbearance, of which Alicia will talk, where the enforcers follow electoral incentives in changing enforcement patterns. And the third one type of non-enforcement is what we call systematic selective non-enforcement, that could be along a category of people or a regional definition. Non-compliance can also happen because enforcement is non-punitive. That means the fines and the sanctions are very low. So low that they don't change behavior and act as a toll, if you want. And the chapter by Belén and Candelaria really illuminate that example. And finally, the non-compliance could be the result of weak state capacity relative to societal resistance. because the states always need state co-production. The society, to the extent that the society doesn't stop the state or helps the state, affects the state capacity. And here we look at, as examples, at the standoffish or in different states, of which Eduardo will talk because his chapter talks about how states that have few resources go where it's easier, enforce where it's easier, where they're pushed to enforce. The other example we have is aspirational laws that Mala will mention here, laws that are adopted not with the expectation of an immediate application, but that the enforcement will change over time, there will be more societal co-production. And finally, the third dimension of weakness that we discuss in our typology and is exemplified in the book is that of instability, when the rules do not last for long and the actors assume that the rules will be not there for a very long period and do not change their behavior in the expectation that the rule will be changed. The example that we provide is that of serial replacement. We can think now of repeal and replace given the current times. And the chapter, one chapter that exemplifies this, that illustrates this, is the chapter by Ernesto Calvo and Gabriel Negreto on electoral institutions that change much more often in Latin America than in Western Europe. I'm not going to just tell the whole book, but I really want to emphasize how important was in the emergence of this typology and on the conditions to explain this typology, the two conferences and the discussion with the authors, how much was this of a collaborative project, and the fact that the chapters provide not just new concepts, but also empirical indicators of how to measure this concept in a comparative way. I think this was an incredible enterprise and one that was extremely pleasurable to have with such a great group of people. We also think that this is an important research agenda. I think Latin Americanists have always looked at this as an important research agenda because we have identified the prevalence of these political strategies in Latin America, the variation in their use across and within countries. But we also believe this is an important comparative political agenda. We think it's used in other regions of the world. And we think that even in all democracies, we now see institutional weakening. So the research agenda will expand. So I'm leaving it here. And I thank again everyone for coming. And of course, the authors for presenting their chapters.
Thank you, Vicky. It's now the turn of Alicia Holland, who is an associate professor in the government department at Harvard. She studies the comparative political economy of development with a focus on Latin America. And her first book is Forbearance as Redistribution, the Politics of Informal Welfare in Latin America. I loved a book that examines the politics of law enforcement against the poor. Alicia?
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. And first of all, congratulations to the editors who pulled together a terrific volume and also invited us to 2 wonderful workshops in the days when we actually could travel and discuss ideas in person. So what I want to do today is just try to give you a brief overview of the central argument of my chapter on this idea of coercion gaps. Second, I'm bored of my own work these days, so I'm going to extend what I do in the chapter just to give an illustration from our current times of COVID-19 of what a coercion gap looks like. And then I'll just offer one last comment, sort of thinking about sort of open questions around this idea of a coercion gap and institutional weakness more broadly. So first of all, in Latin America, we often see large gaps between the written law and how that law is enforced in practice. And one of the big questions is whether the law on paper or the actual lived experience comes closer to voters and the public's preferences. And what I try to argue in this chapter is that actually this sort of seeming disjuncture between written law and the lived enforced experience actually reflects what the public sometimes wants. And particularly this occurs in contexts where people are what Dan Brinks might say below the law rather than above the law. So in particular, when we're thinking about how laws that the poor tend to violate are enforced. So what do I mean by this? Well, at the level of popular preferences, I first came across this idea looking at public opinion data towards squatters. And when you ask people whether they support the law in the abstract, so a ban on squatting or the protection of private property against squatters, they voice very strong support. But if you ask people, do you support the eviction of squatters? Do you think the government should fine people who build their houses illegally? You see much, much weaker support. And so in fact, if you ask about evictions across class groups, you see support plummet. And so this is one way in which a coercion gap appears, which is that you can have coexisting preferences in which people want a strict standard, they want a ban on some behavior, and at the same point, they don't support the coercion or the sorts of enforcement measures and sanctions that often accompany that ban, and in some cases really may be necessary to achieve the abstract ideal in the written law. Now again, I think these gaps are particularly wide when law enforcement affects a sympathetic group in some way. So squatters tend to be poor. You also see very similar dynamics in illegal immigration, where much of the public supports restrictive border policies, but doesn't support the deportation of unauthorized immigrants in their community. And so these gaps can emerge precisely because the public finds the coercion in some way unacceptable in a democratic society. Now, coercion gaps, I argue, exist not just due to the sort of internal tensions within the public's preferences, but also from the institutional process in which laws are made and enforced. So at the legislative stage, political actors often think in terms of abstract goals, and they face pressure to also use the law to signal those abstract goals. And so legislatures often face a lot of pressure to increase coercive sanctions in an attempt to signal their condemnation for particular behaviors, or to achieve that level of compliance that much of the public actually wants. There also are different groups that are powerful at the legislative stage. So we might think that organized interest groups, oftentimes better off groups, can be more powerful in lobbying for certain formal provisions and institutional rules. So institutional rules often become more punitive, and they often are more punitive as non-compliance also increases in society, creating more pressure to make the law signal the importance of banning or getting a certain level of compliance in society. Now, meanwhile, at the enforcement stage, political actors, whether they're police or they're bureaucrats charged with enforcing particular rules, can run real lives being disrupted by sanctions set on paper. So the distributive impacts of enforcement on individual lives and communities, rather than the broad institutional aims of the law, become visible. The institutional actors that are important also shift at the enforcement stage. So you often see territorially organized local interest groups have greater leverage to bargain with politicians to pressure for enforcement policies that suit their own sense of what an ideal level of compliance would be. So as non-compliance increases, the number of local constituents affected by regulations or sympathetic to the interests of those that are facing sanctions can create electoral pressure to forego sanctions. So this is what in my broader work I call forbearance, or sort of local political choices intentionally not to enforce the law. And those preferences come from electoral pressures. They can be implemented by selecting bureaucrats who share their preferences. And in these ways, politicians and local politics will often tend to weaken institutional rules. So it's really this misalignment between legislative incentives to make the law look more punitive, to signal stronger condemnation of behavior, and then local bureaucratic and electoral pressures that give rise to what I call this coercion gap. Now, a key takeaway of my chapter is that it's not necessarily the case that institutional weakness arises from disagreement with the ambition of an institution, to put it in the terms of this volume's introduction. Instead, political conflict often can center over the enforcement measures that are necessary to achieve a particular institutional aim. So the second thing I want to do today is just give you an example of a coercion gap from the times in which we're living of COVID-19. So many people want those in society to wear masks, to quarantine, but many other people also get uncomfortable when we start talking about using police power to throw people in jail, to sanction people who aren't wearing masks if they don't comply. And this aversion can be particularly great in circumstances where we think that many of the people being affected by health regulations, by requirements to wear masks or quarantine, simply can't comply given their economic circumstances. So many of us have seen the images going around of street vendors in Latin America sort of saying, you know, I can die from COVID or I can die from hunger. So in a circumstance where the choice is really so dire, much of the public will say, well, of course people can't quarantine. They need to be out in the streets working. It would be inappropriate to use coercion against those who are simply trying to make a living. And so coercion gaps tend to open in cases where the welfare state, where structural conditions mean that some part of the population really struggle to apply with the formal rules. Now, of course, this isn't just about creating the social conditions for compliance. There are many other things that shape the sort of culture around compliance that are also important. And just to give you another example from the COVID-19 case, I love what happened in Taiwan, where basically, first of all, the Taiwanese government distributed masks to every citizen. So immediately it's removing one of the barriers to compliance, which probably makes enforcement much more legitimate among Taiwanese society. But it also created a hotline for citizens who had trouble accessing their masks or maybe thought that it was, you know, too costly or had some trouble wearing them. And a boy wrote to the Taiwanese government saying that, you know, his government allocation of masks was pink. And if he wore his pink mask to school, he would be teased and bullied, so he wouldn't be able to comply. And so the next day, all of the ministers of Taiwan wore pink masks on television. So closing a coercion gap is in part about creating the economic and social conditions that allow for citizens to comply and that create legitimacy in the state's enforcement activities. But of course, a coercion gap also comes from a lack of legitimacy from the regulation itself, which can be closed in many cultural and more symbolic ways, like the Taiwanese ministers illustrate. Now, just to end, I want to give one more sort of speculative comment about coercion gaps, and one of the things that I think a lot about in sort of connecting even my own work. So for those of us who study Latin America and think about criminal law, it may seem really odd to talk about a coercion gap. You know, when I study crime, I've emphasized that it's popular demand for coercive policies that in part leads politicians to support mano duro type policies, to use excessive use of force. So there's popular demand for coercion when we think about criminal law. So who is this constituency that's opposed to coercion, opposed to sanctions, and creating these coercion gaps in non-criminal law cases? How do we reconcile that popular demand for mano duro policies when we think about crime with the type of coercion gap that I'm arguing often exists in things like squatting or street vending, or even in the case of COVID-19? And part of this is, you know, much more speculative in the sense we could just make a distinction between hard crime and other types of regulations. So what I'm talking about are really things that, you know, maybe are more debatable about whether they are good or bad to enforce. And so there is greater societal disagreement than in the case of criminal law. But when I think about, you know, sort of this broader question, I think part of it comes down to when do we think the middle and upper classes actually have solidarity and sympathy for those who are regulated. And there are cases where actually, you know, squatters really are perceived as criminals, or street vendors become kind of dubbed as mafia groups. And I think one of the hard parts is trying to figure out actually when you have a public that is relatively sympathetic to the demands of the poor versus when you have a public that is pushing for greater and greater coercion. And there are a couple of different ways that we can think about the factors that shape how those in violation of the law are perceived. One is just to say, well, Alicia, you're studying circumstances when you're looking at squatting and street vending that really are threats to subsistence. So going back to sort of James Scott perspective, where there's something really different about enforcing laws that threaten someone's level of subsistence. And maybe that is what we come to with a street vendor who's saying, I can comply or I can eat. That obviously limits the circumstances where we'd think that social solidarities develop that would support coercion gaps. There's a second interpretation which sees this as really about the ways that racial, ethnic, and class cleavages in a society are constructed to change solidarities across time and across place. And then the question really is, when do you see the middle class actually sort of aligning with lower income groups? And then third, I think there's a more institutional perspective that says that coercion gaps are really going to be dependent on the broader institutional context in a country. So coercion gaps I see very, very clearly in cases like Colombia and Brazil, where there are social rights that people really understand in addition to the sorts of regulations or property rights that I'm talking about. So it might be in those cases where you actually have a social rights framework where you see the strongest solidarities developing among politicians, bureaucrats, and other citizens that are going to expand coercion gaps. So this is all just to say that I think there are important open questions about the different institutional contexts where we see coercion gaps, and also the measures that society and legislatures more broadly might take to close those coercion gaps and bridge this division between laws on paper and the lived experience. So I'll leave it there, and thank you again for letting me share this chapter.
Thank you, Alicia. It's now the turn of Mala Htun, who's a political science professor at University of New Mexico. Her most recent book is The Logics of Gender, Justice, State Action, and Women's Rights Around the World. Mala?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and thanks to Vicky and Steve and Dan for organizing this amazing project that I'm honored to be a part of, and thank you, Javier, for chairing the session today. I am going to share my screen because I have some slides to use in the presentation, so just bear with me while I do this. Okay, let me go to the beginning and okay, here we go. So my chapter is co-authored with Francesca Jensenius, and in this chapter we present the concept of violence against women legislation as an aspirational right. And we analyze the extent to which these new second generation violence against women laws can be considered weak institutions. And I'm gonna take that Vicky or Steve or Alicia will signal to me or wave to me if all of a sudden you can't hear me. I've got dogs barking very loudly in the room right next to me. So one of the main achievements of the global rights revolution for women has been the enactment of laws intended to prevent, punish, and protect victims of gender and sexual violence. On the top panel in this slide, you can see an overview, a global overview. The lighter colored countries have specific legislation to combat violence against women. The gray countries have penalties, and then a smaller group of countries in dark have neither. And you can see from the panel on the bottom that the vast majority of these laws are pretty comprehensive. That is, they don't reduce violence against women simply to domestic abuse, hitting or kicking. They consider violence to be an expansive concept, the one promoted by the feminist movement, which involves a variety of forms of behavior and ways that women's dignity and autonomy can be undermined. So you look at all of this global legislation, you look at how comprehensive it is, and then it raises the question of, so what? These laws are on the books, but there is a huge gap between law and practice, as we know, even in countries as so-called advanced as the United States. Even though the laws exist, violence against women remains prevalent, far too common in multiple settings. So workplaces, schools, public institutions like hospitals, homes, institutions of higher education, and so forth. So the existence of the laws and the persistence of bad behavior raises the question of whether global laws to combat violence against women are merely another weak institution. So in our chapter, we present the concept of, I'll just call them VA laws, because the acronym VA is for violence against women. We present this concept of VA laws as aspirational rights. And aspirational rights are characterized almost by construction as a weak institution. So they aim to change behaviors and attitudes that are slow moving and that are quite entrenched. So in this case, violence against women legislation aims to change the gender unequal society that is conducive to violence. So most feminist analysis says that violence is not just a matter of alcoholism, aggression, the job loss due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is the product of a context of gender inequality. So VAW laws aspire to transform this cultural and social context that is conducive to violence against women. They express new norms and in that way push society and adjust an egalitarian direction. And so by construction, they're weak, meaning at the time of their enactment, they confront a law practice gap that they then intend to close. Okay, so by construction, they're weak institutions. How does this map onto the typology that Vicky and Steve and Dan present at the beginning of the book? And Vicky just gave a little overview in her introductory remarks about the different ways that institutions can be weak. So in our chapter, we basically describe the ways that violence against women laws are weak institutions, and then we present data to illustrate basically the fact that they are weak. But then I'm going to actually take a right turn at the very end of my talk in the final slide. So just examples of the ways in which they're weak. There's bottom-up non-compliance, as Vicky said. We see pervasive behavioral violations, okay? Men perpetrate violence. We see women also, of course, are perpetrators of violence. We see widespread support for attitudes that run against the spirit of the law. For example, attitudes saying that men should control women in the family and that women owe sexual relations as a condition of marriage. And then we also see bottom-up non-compliance in the form of high costs to reporting. So you would think that if you were beaten by your partner, that you could go seek help at the women's agency or at the police station. But in fact, women who do this are often dragged through a second process of re-victimization. Police officers say, well, shouldn't you just go home and have sex with him and everything will then be fine? Or they blame the woman, family members blame the woman, and so forth. So we see bottom-up non-compliance, not just from women and men, but from a variety of state actors as well. And then we see, I guess the final examples were examples of top-down non-compliance. So we see that institutions are weak because of patterns of non-compliance. So we try to put some empirical meat on these claims by looking at experiences in Mexico, where there's a long history of feminist mobilization against gender and sexual violence. In fact, it's one of the few issues that women from all political parties and different social sectors tend to agree on, that violence is bad and we need to take massive state action to combat it. We see an evolution of first-generation laws to prevent violence and then second-generation laws, which culminated in this 2007 federal law to guarantee women a life free from violence. And then the states, as they were obliged to, enacted similar laws. At the same time, as we saw with the nationwide women's strike on March 9th, right? When women from across Mexico said, you know, I'm not going to school, I'm not going to work, I'm not going to shop, I'm just going to be absent in order to protest the immense violence that characterizes my life. We see that there is a widespread perception of impunity and a sense that the problem of violence is getting worse. So we look at an amazing national survey called the NDIRE, National Survey on the Dynamics of Household Relations. This survey covered in 2011, 128,000 households, more than 150,000 women. Very long survey, an in-person household survey, tons of questions. And we can see the first point of bottom-up non-compliance, that about half of women who were currently or formerly in a partnership experienced intimate partner violence of the physical, psychological, economic type. And 19% of women in their lifetimes had experienced physical domestic abuse. So being shot at, kicked, hit, strangled, and so forth. In addition to behavioral non-compliance, we also see a lot of attitudes that go against the spirit of the law. Okay, so entrenched social norms that affect people's perceptions and behavior that mean that the institution, that imply that the institution is not actually pulling people, it's not changing behavior in the way that the figure in the first chapter of the Weak Institutions book describes. So we see about a quarter of Mexican women saying that a wife should obey her partner. and that violence is a family matter and should stay that way. We call that the privatization of violence. This isn't something for the state to be involved in. This is just a family matter. And then we see about 20% of people saying that a woman is obliged to have sex with her partner. Now, these are really shockingly high numbers in 2011, given that the national and global feminist movement has been trying to change these sorts of attitudes for many years. By contrast, if you look at the very first bar on the panel, very few people say that a man has the right to hit his wife. However, people hold on to attitudes that support a context of gender inequality, which is conducive to violence. Okay, finally, so just the final data point is that we also see low reporting, right? So I talked about the barriers to reporting and the problems with reporting. So only 15% of women who experienced physical domestic abuse. Now, this isn't psychological or economic abuse. This is being hit, shot at, strangled, etc. Only 15% reported it to a public authority. And if you look at this, the bars in this graph here, women could choose multiple reasons for not reporting it, but what I find really shocking and I want to call your attention to is this reason not important. So 20% of women who didn't report violence said that they didn't report it, even though they had been the victim of physical domestic abuse, said they didn't report it because it wasn't important, which is a sign, we say, of normalization. All right, so my final point is, and this is where I'm throwing my curveball, is, and this isn't in the chapter, but this is the point we're making in a follow-up paper when we're actually looking at all 4 waves of survey data. So we're looking at change over time. And we're making the argument that even weak institutions, which we argue laws on violence are, they're weak institutions, we argue that they can still have an effect on society. And they can still have an effect on society by expressing new norms. And when we look over time at experiences of violence and attitudes and even reporting, which I don't show you here, across all 4 panels, 2003, 2006, 2011, and 2016, there is change over time. So just look at the figure on the left. This is the share of women saying they experienced physical domestic abuse in the previous year. And we see that, yeah, in 2011, it seems high, but it was a heck of a lot higher in 2003 and 2006. If we look at the panel on the right, attitudes, a wife should obey her partner. Just look at the far group of graphs. Yeah, it seems high that about 1/4 of women in 2011 say a wife should obey her partner, but it's a heck of a lot less than the 56% in 2003 who agreed that a wife should obey her partner. So we're arguing now that these laws on violence are weak, but they are nonetheless expressing new norms, and that this expressive power that we're hypothesizing, we find some evidence in the 4 waves of survey data that imply that there has been a change in social norms in line with the new norms expressed in the law. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mala.
Toca.
Eduardo, te toca.
Sí.
Eduardo is a full professor of political science at Pontificia Universidad Católica del Peru. He teaches on comparative public policy and democratization, the state in the developing world. He has published in Comparative Politics, the Journal of Latin American Studies, and the Journal of Politics in Latin America. Eduardo.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Javier, for presentation, and to the editor for making this great volume. So I'm going to talk about my chapter with Matthew Amenwal. It's called The Social Determinants of Informants, Integrating Politics with Limited State Capacity. What the chapter does is putting together Matt's work and my work, that we have been looking at similar things regarding enforcement in Latin America, and looking at this implementation gap, no? Why we have these punishment rules that are not implemented, are not enforced, and how this is a big problem in Latin American states, but more generally in developing states. And also to recognize that sometimes enforcement happens. It's not that this is something that is always at the same level, no? So we look at in the chapter discussing theories that put enforcement related to state capacity as the main explanation of why some rules are enforced. So states that may be more stronger states or more capable states may end up doing more enforcement and states that are not. And we discussed this kind of approach. We go back to it at the end, but we discuss this approach by looking also at political explanations for enforcement. There is a growing literature on how political actors, as Alicia was saying, or social actors can push for enforcement or against enforcement. No, we have cases in which there is a strong pressure by business groups to enforce certain laws, for example, and the states end up enforcing them, or cases in which what Alicia Holland called forbearance, in which there may be good reason for politicians not to enforce the law. They may be looking at electoral gains or some other kind of gains that prevent them from enforcing the law. So we put in all this literature and say, well, state capacity is not enough to explain enforcement, and this literature helps, but with limited state capacity, throwing state capacity back in, we see that there are many cases in which states have to allocate the resources. So sometimes they decide some issue is important and have to be enforced, and other times they can just ignore the issue. Yet by knowing that the law is not always, is in many cases symbolic, or is a law adopted but not followed by politicians, quite frequently bureaucrats can decide not to enforce the law or just leave it dormant until something happens and may be necessary to enforce it. So we say state capacity is not all the answer. There is this political and social actor literature that helps to understand this, but also have in mind that limited state capacity can also play a role in explaining why sometimes you may have there may be no one resisting enforcement, but bureaucrats decide not to enforce, or cases in which you may try to enforce, but by some reasons, by state capacity, you do not. Sorry. So what do we do in the paper? We then try to explain how to put some order on all these situations, and we present two types of political or social pressures that may lead the states to enforce laws. The first one is one that we call diffuse societal pressure, that basically for or against enforcement, sorry, so it's diffuse societal pressure for or against enforcement, that in some cases you have some social political actors or social actors pushing the states to enforce a law in a more general way. It's like a regulation that it doesn't have to be a state law, it can be also a regional government or something like that, but it's a more general application of the law. Or sometimes you have groups that oppose that kind of enforcement. The law exists, but there are groups that push you into not enforcing it. So we divide the kind of state actions in this more general way into three: a proactive state that acts and tries to enforce, a forbearing state that decides not to enforce because there is some sort of political gain involved, and also we introduce this concept of standoff states. Is a concept developed by Dan Slater and Kim, in basically saying there are cases in which the states may stop short from enforcing because they really don't have to divert resources, or there may be some costs. The cost cannot be enough to say that it's a case of state weakness, but it's more of a state that decides not to enforce. They can do more, but they decide not to enforce. So we have these three possibilities: a proactive state, a standoffish state, and a forbearing state that may decide to enforce a law. But this is not all the possibilities. When we approach the point of enforcement, the place where the state will actually act and try to enforce the law, we have two kinds of dynamics. Sometimes there is societal support proximate to the point of enforcement. There may be social groups or social actors that may help the state to enforce a law. So the state may be weak. We were saying the state capacity is not everything, but the state may be weak. But if you have, like in the case of Matt Amengual's work, strong unions that will take the labor inspectors to private industry and provide them with evidence about the violations of certain regulations, then you have social groups supporting and helping the state to act accordingly to the law. At the same time, you can also have social groups that resist the law, that oppose. We make this distinction of sometimes you have a co-produced enforcement, the state and social actors, but you can also have blocked enforcement. Social actors stop the prevent enforcement even if the state tries. And also we have an interesting case in which the state has, in a general way, has decided not to apply the law, but there might be some local dynamics that lead to society pushing state action. So we will see the cases in a bit, but it's basically the case in the state has no strong interest in this issue, and you will find some regional variation, for example, in which in some municipalities or some regions, you may have this kind of action. So let me share now my screen so you can take a look at the cases. So we discussed the following 5 cases with this idea of diffuse or pressures for or against and the point of enforcement. We have the case of Peru Gold, the gold rush in Peru that started a decade ago, bringing a lot of people to extract gold, and the state eventually, after a while, after taking a standoffish position, deciding to enforce and control the social problem. But they faced a lot of societal resistance proximate to the point of enforcement. All these areas where is this activity, you will find blocked enforcement. The state cannot enforce properly the regulations. Bolivia gold is very interesting. It's more diffuse pressures, but against enforcement. The mass government in Bolivia has many linkages with miners doing this kind of informal or formal but not regulated activity in a way that they let them do. There is not a clear control of what they're doing, and that's a forbearance, kind of forbearance result with non-enforcement, but by political reasons. Peru construction, this is the construction boom in Peru. It created a lot of illegal unions that blackmailed and did a lot of racketing with constructors. In this case, constructors, small, medium, and big constructor, and the state co-produce enforcement to try to control the issue and enforce criminal regulations against this kind of activity. Brick makers in Cordoba, here there is no interest in brick makers, like nobody cares much about them because in many cases they are immigrants, they are not properly voters, there is no interest by politicians for them, so nobody cares of what is happening. So there is no diffuse pressure and there is no proximal pressure. There are not many civil society groups demanding action, so we find this more close to standoff. Santa Fe environment is a case in which there is no diffuse pressure for or against enforcement at the regional, at the national level, but there is a strong demand at the local level leading to society-dependent enforcement. We lack a case for diffuse pressure against enforcement and social support close to the point of enforcement. No? Maybe that brings police killings in which there is not a state common implementation of rules against police killings, but there is variation depending on how strong civil society is. I am very close to finish. Conclusions: institutions are more likely to gain strength in instances of standoff than forbearance, basically because there is no resistance. Our findings reaffirm the importance of the state capacity, especially because of all these issues of standoff, cases in which really the state has to decide where to divert resources, so stronger states may reduce this kind of standoffish position. Also, when enforcement is co-produced, there is more likelihood that institutions will gain relevance, especially if social support is sustained over time, than when enforcement occurs only by diffuse or proximal pressures. No? Proximal support is very unlikely to produce institutional strength because it's very particular. And lastly, instances of block enforcements may be a blessing in disguise, because like in the case of Peru's gold rush, you have more resources directed to the issue. There is resistance, but the moment that the price of gold is reduced, you already have a stronger institutional agencies and resources to control the issue. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for running, but it was a lot of stuff in here.
Thank you, Eduardo. And now, let me see if in my screen I don't see Aníbal, but yes, he is there.
I see Eduardo's screen still. I'm the only one? Okay.
Yes. Most of you prospective authors know Aníbal as the editor of Aníbal Pérez-Liñán as the editor of Latin American Research Review. I'm sure you had some beef with him in the past at some point. Aníbal, he's professor of political science and global affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and he is, as I said, the editor of LAR. His research focuses on political institutions, executive legislative relations, and the rule of law in new democracies. And he will be commenting on the presentations thus far.
Thank you, Javier. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for the invitation. This is a fantastic book, and I want to congratulate the editors, of course, and the authors, because as the audience has seen, this is a wonderful book. It's a wonderful book not only because it introduces new concepts, it makes important theoretical contributions, but mainly I think because it will open new research agendas. And what I would like to do in the few minutes I have is to provide some examples of how this book can open research agendas. As Vicky mentioned earlier, in the introductory chapter, Dan, Steve, and Vicky identified 3 forms of institutional weakness, which are the insignificance of institutions, and most importantly for the works that populate the book, the phenomenon of non-compliance and the issue of institutional instability. So the book clearly articulates novel ways to understand non-compliance, and we have seen this in the presentations. Alicia's concept of coercion gaps, Mala's work on aspirational laws, Eduardo's analysis of state capacity and enforcement based on the interaction with social actors. Something I find particularly attractive of the book is that those works kind of point out to quite often to an ambiguity in the meaning of compliance and enforcement for institutions. So these are very rich chapters. Now, for the 170 people who are watching us now, like they say on TV, I would like to say, but wait, because there is more. So there is a whole part of this book that has not been discussed so far, and that I would like to discuss quickly, which is the whole issue of institutional instability, this other form of institutional weakness that Vicky mentioned at the beginning. And at least 3 chapters in the book deal with issues of institutional instability or serial replacement. And I think it opened very important questions. So the main point I would like to emphasize before I discuss these books and at the end, these chapters and at the end, is that I think there is a very important question here, research question for the future, which is how can we distinguish between instability traps from just frail institutions, what I would call institutional frailty. So let me just quickly discuss some of these chapters and how they approach the issue of institutional instability, which is the part of the book, the side of the book that has not been discussed in the presentations so far, which focus mostly on non-compliance. So one of the chapters that addresses this problem of instability is a chapter by Ernesto Calvo and Gabriel Negreto that I think Vicky mentioned before, which analyzes the problem of serial replacement in relation to electoral rules. So what they show, what Calvo and Negreto show is that there has been enormous instability on the electoral systems in Latin America. And any electoral regime in Latin America is very unlikely to survive past beyond 2 decades. So electoral systems have changed a lot in Latin America. And the question is, of course, what drives this instability of electoral rules in the region for them. And they point out to incentives, which in their view has to do mostly with electoral shocks, that is electoral volatility that creates either defensive or offensive incentives for politicians to change the electoral rules. And also capacity, which has to do to what extent the executive is constrained when he or she wants to change those institutional rules. And so they analyze change in electoral systems for Latin American countries using quantitative data. The second chapter that addresses the problem of institutional instability, but from a very different perspective, from a very different angle, is a chapter by Michael Vertus and Victor Menaldo. And in their case, they analyze the survival of constitutions. But here the story is different. For them, stability, not change, is the problem here, because the authors know that dictatorships create quite often the constitutional framework that binds democracies. Over 70% of all new democracies inherit an authoritarian constitution from the past. And so the key question for them is, under what conditions are democracies able to replace authoritarian constitutions? And the chapter focuses on three explanations. The death of the former dictator, that's a signal that the old guard is gone in a way and the new democracy is freer to change the constitution. But also there are kind of exogenous shocks that map into an economic crisis or a shift in economic openness, because globalization induces changes in economic power in the country. So they analyze the survival of 80 constitutions inherited from authoritarian rulers. And what they find, which is quite interesting, is that economic shocks and globalization matter for the renewal of constitutions under democracies, but only after the death of the dictator. That's the key mechanism. And the third chapter that I would like to discuss very quickly is Gretchen Helmke's chapter, in which she analyzes presidential crises. She has an analysis of 36 presidential crises in Latin America, and she essentially comes to the conclusion that presidential crisis, that is conflicts between the executive and the legislature, or between the elected powers and the judiciary, are mainly triggered by a gap between the president's constitutional powers, the jure powers, and the president's actual legislative powers, partisan powers in the legislature. So her instinct is that legislatures attack presidents when presidents have enough constitutional powers to impose policy unilaterally, but they lack the legislative coalition that is large enough to block an impeachment, for example. And I think her chapter is very interesting because she concludes with an idea of institutional traps, meaning that presidential crises repeat themselves in the same countries. So taking together, the reason why I'm discussing those countries is because all three of them address the problem of institutional instability, which is a different problem conceptually from the problem of enforcement or compliance, right? And taking together these chapters open, I think, a very interesting research agenda on the problem of institutional instability for the future, which I think has to do mainly with the question of, as I said before, the dilemma between whether we are observing instability traps or just frail institutions that produce recurrent events of instability. So the chapters show that some countries experience institutional instability more than others, right? And it's often the same countries in the chapters. So Ecuador, for example, emerges as the most unstable country using different metrics in Calvo and Negreto's chapter and in Helmke's chapter in Latin America. But the question is, what drives these differences across countries? And it seems to me that two possible answers are possible here. The first one is that there is what I would call structural frailty for institutions. And that would mean that some structural weaknesses make institutions consistently fragile in some contexts. And therefore, given these conditions, some random events may trigger repeated institutional change. So for example, both Calvo and Negreto and Alberto and Menaldo in their chapters make the case that bad economic conditions make institutions weak and facilitate replacement. And thus it could be that weak economies create weak institutions. And so if this is the case, there would be high risk and low risk environments depending on economic conditions, but levels of risk in a way would be constant, right? So this would not be an instability trap as much as a case of persistent weakness, given the structural conditions. But then there is a possibility that Helmke introduces in her chapter, which is the possibility of actual instability traps. And this would imply that one event of institutional replacement or institutional instability makes the next event more likely. So this would be essentially situations of positive feedback that could involve reverse causality, for example. So Calvo and Negreto suggest at the end of their chapter that the change in electoral rules produces more electoral volatility, and more electoral volatility facilitates more changes in institutional rules. And Helmke in her chapter discusses several other mechanisms that potentially create recurrent patterns, like, for example, the situations in which the response to fix the crisis makes the problem even worse. So in Ecuador, the institutional reforms made presidents stronger, which actually created more new crises. Or actors may learn how to undermine institutions and become more adept at doing that. Or there may be a decline in public support for institutions that are consistently attacked, and so there is a lot of legitimacy. So structural frailty and instability traps are not exclusive, of course. They're not exclusive mechanisms, but they are hard to disentangle. However, they involve different data generating processes, and if conceptualized properly, they would involve very different empirical implications, right? In the language of Eurasian models, we are talking about frailties versus recurrent events, so to speak. And I think this is just one way, one example in which this wonderful book, I think, opens an agenda of research that will mark many researchers, and I'm sure many people in the audience, for the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aníbal. And now I'm not sure how should we proceed, because I know there's an option Q&A, and there's already someone who posted a question, Vicky, but I don't know if we go that way.
There's also questions in the chat, I have to say. So maybe you wanna try to gather those, and I think Steve and Dan got in charge of answering questions, and also the chapter, the authors of the chapters.
Some people are posting questions on the chat. Some others are posting questions on the Q&A. So, but that's fine. Let me, because the chat also has a lot of other stuff.
So why don't you start with the Q&A, and I would cut and paste into the Q&A.
Perfect.
Otherwise.
This comes from, this goes to Alicia Holland, regarding the mano dura versus coercion gaps in Latin America. I don't know, Alicia, if you're able to read. I will read it out loud, but are you able to read? Yes. So I'm going to read it out loud. I had trouble understanding why there would be a coercion gap for parents. It disappeared. The question just disappeared.
Go to the insert. I think it got switched to answered somehow.
All right, it's Professor Holland regarding
yes.
the mano dura versus coercion gaps in Latin America. I had trouble understanding why there would be a coercion gap for parents given the power of organized business. For example, big mining companies can pressure governments to clamp down protests, mining companies using the police against mining protests. Professor Dargent just mentioned this. How these fit into a coercion gap theory? I guess it depends on factors such as those you mentioned. That's the question.
Great. Well, thank you for the question. And I think this picks up on a lot of themes that we actually discussed in the workshops and as a group. So to answer this, I think there's sort of two ways in which you see these sorts of coercion gaps develop. So one is to really think about the territorial differences and where interest groups have power. So for example, we might think big mining companies are very effective in lobbying the national legislature and exerting pressure in formal arenas. But a lot of the action of enforcement happens at a much more local level. You need local mayors to agree. You sometimes need the mayor to deploy the local police. In some cases, mining companies, or you can think of organized interest groups more broadly, have trouble really exerting the same amount of lobbying force at a more local level. So this comes up a lot in Candelaria Garay's and Belén Melendez's chapter on Argentina and deforestation, but this is a dynamic I think also Eduardo and Matt's chapter brings up of this sort of federal or decentralized nature of law setting and enforcement that can open up the sorts of coercion gaps that I'm talking about as well. A sort of related point has to do with the institutional arena. So I put emphasis on the sort of gap between the legislative arena, where you often have pressure for the sort of abstract setting of the law, versus the actual institutions that do enforcement on the ground. Or you can think again, sort of different levels of government, local governments that might be in charge. And so I think that's one of the ways in which you see coercion gaps open, even when you have pretty powerful organized interest groups. And we could extend this again. Immigration, you can say business is very effective in setting a restrictive immigration policy, but less effective in controlling local deportation decisions. Or you could say kind of similarly in the case of, you know, my book is, or what I write about in the book is squatting, where construction chambers are very effective in sort of putting criminal penalties against squatting, against those who organize squatter settlements, and yet they're not very effective when it comes to changing decisions about evictions and how the law is enforced. So that's where I see the sort of site for a big gap between law and practice. Vicky also said, can you elaborate on the potential role of social networks in catalyzing or preventing social?
Yeah, that's actually a question from the chat that I put there.
Okay, I don't know if Matt, if Eduardo wants to take that, because actually I think it comes up just as much in Matt and Eduardo's chapter.
Yes, I think this kind of argument has been made before by Dan Brinks is here and other working on rights from the when do rights become effective, and quite frequently it's not when you have the law or the content of the law, but when you have social demand. No? Somebody demanding and exercising the right. So we talk a little about that in the chapter, how enforcement has to do with that kind, also with that kind of pressure, and also to obviously how you block enforcement at the local level if there is a dense social network preventing or questioning the action of the state. You can limit the action of the state, or if you are supporting it, maybe because something has become politicized and there are dense networks that want that outcome, you can have that kind of support. And more recently, with a colleague, Stephanie Rousseau, we have been working on laws against violence against women, and how in many of them were very symbolic. There was little resources directed to this kind of action, state action, not a lot of work on enforcement, and you have like these 5-year plans that have all this kind of planning of what you were going to do, but they didn't landed on that kind of effective enforcement. But after the Me Too movement, Ni Una Menos, and a lot of politicization of very gruesome cases of violence against women in 2016, you see a change in the state in which this kind of demand is leading to more resources, so higher state capacity, and more action and changes in legislation to enforce. Still very short from being highly effective, but leading to closing this kind of implementation gap. So that's the kind of phenomenon we're talking about.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in for a little bit too. And I want to say a couple of things. One is, if you've been listening throughout, you will know exactly why this was such a great project and why it was so much fun to be at the workshops that produced the volume. And it's really the chapters that are phenomenal and provide a lot of information, both sort of knowledge about what's happening, but also really new openings into new research agendas, as Aníbal was saying. But on this question of sort of social networks, I mean, I think there are two really important ways in which they operate. One is in what Eduardo earlier was describing as a sort of site of enforcement, right? Where social networks can do a lot of the work of enforcement, of co-producing enforcement, right? They can provide information, they can provide local knowledge, they provide sometimes the local muscle, right, to make things happen. But then there's this other work, which is sort of closer to what Htun was describing in Mexico, which is the work of changing the political environment around enforcement, right? And creating a social demand for enforcement. So, you know, the one thing you can do at a very local level and being very sort of focused on the particular violation, like, you know, a community that's upset about a particular mine, for example. But the other thing requires sometimes a more national presence. And so social networks can work very differently depending on the issue and depending on who they are and what their focus is.
There are two questions for Mala. Mala, you there? Yes. The first one is if you could explain more how evidence supports a causal relationship between the weak application of violence against women laws and societal change on views on violence against women, if there could be a case of reverse causality there. And the second one is how effective were on the ground communities, the implementation of the Mexico 2007 gender violence law at that time, are still working those different places in which the women can report abuse or violation of their rights?
So I'll just answer them both together. So first of all, I think that the case of the gender and sexual violence legislation is an example of what Dan was just talking about, which is the co-production of enforcement. In our second paper, not in this chapter, we describe what we call a feminist activism, legal change, media coverage bundle. So activism and then media coverage of spectacular violations drove the enactment of new legislation, but activism also drives behavioral change that's aligned with the law, as well as enforcement efforts by local communities. And so it's impossible, you know, this isn't a controlled experiment, this is the messy real world. And so it's impossible to kind of tease out the different strands of this bundle, right? I mean, the effects of activism versus the effects of the legal change, they're bound up together, and activists use the legal change, which as leverage to then have more legitimacy and credibility in their activism efforts. And so we don't, you know, sort of cleanly identify the effects of the law as separate from the effects of activism and the effects of the media coverage. And then the other thing is that I think it's important to recognize that the aim of violence against women legislation and the aim of expressive laws generally is not pervasive state, top-down coercive enforcement. The aim is bottom-up compliance. The aim is, you know, people who willingly change their behavior to align with the law. And we present a theory based on Richard McAdams's esteem theory of norms, because they want to gain the esteem of others by complying with norms and avoid losing the esteem that comes with major normative violations. And so the aim of most legislation is bottom-up compliance. It's not just sort of surveillance and deterrence. So I do think that there's extreme variation in the effectiveness of grassroots communities and different geographical municipal governments in the effectiveness with which they're enforcing the law. But that the aim is not just top-down enforcement, but bottom-up compliance.
Thanks, Mala. I'm waiting to see if there's other questions. Can I ask one question as moderator? May I, Vicky? And this will show how ignorant I'm the only one who is not a political scientist here, but and this will sort of show my ignorance about this literature. I was just catching up on informal institutions, and then you decided to go for weak institutions, and now I'm confused a little bit. So, can there be informal institutions that are very strong? I'm thinking of my old, you know, thing, patronage, right? And I'm also thinking from the bottom up, you know, squatting seems to be a very strong, as a set of crystallized practices, it seems to be a very strong institution. I'm not asking for definitions, but I'm asking to see if there are in your mind differences between sort of weak institutions and informal ones, and what is the relationship? I'm sure you talked about this in the book, but I just want to know, and I'm using my prerogative as moderator to ask a silly question.
I guess I can probably answer that one, since I'm guilty of writing about both weak and informal institutions. I should point out that Vicky and I published our first book on weak institutions before there were any books published on informal institutions. So it's not the sequence that you suggest. We were out there early on. Yes, there can definitely be strong informal institutions. What's really hard to identify is weak informal institutions, because it's hard if a weak informal institution, an unwritten rule is not being enforced, you basically have nothing. You can see, as we see in the United States today, the weakening of informal institutions, people abandoning norms, abandoning established practice, getting scolded, but not getting punished sufficiently, and the norms erode. So the US is an interesting case study in the weakening of them. But you pointed to some, in the United States went almost 150 years with an unwritten 2-term limit in the presidency. That is a pretty strong informal institution. The Dedazo in Mexico for half a century was a very strong informal institution. So there's not a clear or direct relationship between informality and weakness.
Thank you, Steve. Now we have more questions. This one is, there's one for Alicia, one for Eduardo, and one for Mala. So I'm gonna start with Alicia. I'm really interested in the idea, this is from Rebecca Hanson. I'm really interested in this idea of some issues causing more sympathy than others, which contributes to the coercion gap. Was wondering if you have written about the local factors, what local factors might produce this reaction. I'm thinking about media portrayals, for example, how people are informed about the issue, or which state institution is charged with dealing with the problem. For example, does it matter if it is the military rather than the police who clears water settlements, or perhaps a civilian institution? Or do you think this is mostly about the issues themselves?
Great question, and I'd say it's one that, you know, I sort of touch on in my broader book on forbearance, but is left pretty open in the book. So just sort of two empirical things. So I don't think it's entirely about the issue. I think the question of how the media portrays those who are breaking the law is very important. Although I think even media portrayals, you can say, are driven usually by broader structural forces or political forces. And so, for example, with something like street vending in the 1980s in Peru, street vending is entirely portrayed as an economic issue. It is a product of the failure to integrate the labor force into the formal economy. It comes out of, you know, the sort of weak industrialization. And so there's a very sympathetic portrayal. That changes very sharply in the late 80s. And you can say part of that is the intellectual influence of people like Hernando de Soto. Part of that is sort of growing neoliberal ideas more broadly, but it suddenly becomes about the sort of legal compliance and the fact that, you know, the laws are kind of repressing street vending. And so as long as we give people the conditions to formalize their business, you know, they should basically be kicked out of the streets. And so you see a pretty sharp shift in media portrayals. In contrast, in Colombia, throughout this period, there's a very sympathetic portrayal of street vendors. It continues with a sort of 1980s view that these are people who need a job, who haven't been integrated into the economy, and if anything, it gets more sympathetic with the 1991 Constitution. And so I do think there are broader sort of media factors, intellectual influences, ideas about where black comes from, that really shapes how social sympathies develop. And I would just say some of those structural factors have to do with how the economy is doing. Some of them have to do with, you know, the sort of strength of the political left and political movements in a country. And then I think there's a clear kind of racial dimension to all of this as well, which comes up in my book project when I bring in the case of Istanbul, Turkey, and suddenly street vendors are seen as coming from a different ethnic background as you get more Kurdish migration into the city, and that criminalizes street vending pretty sharply in a city like Istanbul. So I think all of those factors probably shape when issues get understood as sort of hard crime and sort of worthy of going after with the full coercive power of the state. But there's certainly a lot more research that can be done on that.
Thanks, Alicia. This is a question for Eduardo. I don't know if you, Eduardo, you can see it in the blocked enforcement case that you mentioned in your chapter. Did you find in your research any link between the illegal mining, some people sought the term to call it artisanal mining, and the money laundering operations of the drug trafficking groups that have business in the region?
Yes, no, the illegal mining can come as very strong, because it's, I am not suggesting necessarily that this is linked to like organized crime activities always. In many cases, it's more small artisanal mining that's somehow formal and informal. It can also be informal mining. The Peruvian authorities call informal mining to the kind of mining that can be formalized, and illegal mining to the mining that cannot be formalized. Like if you are mining in an area that is a reserve, a natural reserve, that's illegal. Informal will be if you are doing it without a proper license. No? But in real, what I mean by illegal is that it's all not legal. All of it is done in a way that it doesn't comply with the requirements. And a lot of the artisanal mining may have license, may be doing other stuff that does not comply with the requirement. So I will say, no, in many occasions, you don't see this kind of criminal linkage, like it's the case that you may be doing this for a living and selling it. At the same time, you do find, it's not that this is a good guys, bad guys story. Sometimes you end up selling this and it gets into a criminal system. No, it's not that maybe that the person doing it, it's linked to the system, but the way you sell it. And for example, like in the case of Peru, when you ask for more formalities to sell it, you end up pushing some of the people to a more to other more illegal ways of selling the gold. No, like we had this chat with a bureaucrat that was in charge of collecting taxes, and he was complaining that the more requirement you put to control the stuff, the less taxes are collected, because people will not declare the gold. They know that they cannot prove that it's really legal gold. That is obviously is illegal. No, so it plays in many ways. But yes, you do find a lot of sexual abuse, trafficking, women trafficking, and la ruta del oro, the way you take out gold, can be used to take out many other stuff, not just gold. So it's closely linked. I will not call this a criminal enterprise, because a lot of people are doing it, and they are doing it for survival or for having, but there is criminal activities all over the place also. Thank you.
Gracias, Eduardo. Thanks, Eduardo. Mala, this is a question for you. Yes, I can see. At what point in time we can say a weak aspirational institution, like in the case of the violence against women laws, is just a failed aspirational institution, or how can we differentiate them?
So I know that there's a big echo because I got my floors redone last week, and so all the sound in the house is bouncing off of these floors that don't have carpets on them yet. But most laws fail to completely transform behavior. So the question is, should we just throw up our hands and give up and not enact legal reforms at all? No, I mean, I just think that we need to continue to find better ways, more evidence-based ways to align behavior and attitudes with the law. So in terms of how we differentiate them, there are a couple of fine-grained studies on social norms interventions. Arias has a study on a Oaxacan village showing that a common knowledge condition where people were together exposed to a message about gender violence being bad were more likely then to condemn gender violence. And people know that gender violence is bad because the law at the federal and state levels is a normative anchor that lodges in the universe of people's heads. And so it's a good reminder. There's another study in the US about how people subjected to an intervention where the FMLA, that is the Family and Medical Leave Act, was mentioned as national law, were less likely then to penalize caregivers when it came to pay and promotion than a condition when there was no information about the fact that non-discrimination is enshrined in law. So I think that there are empirical ways to test, but I think that the broader point you're bringing up, we have to recognize that all laws fail, but it's still worth reforming and enacting them.
Thanks, Mala. There's also some fun mail here. I will read it. But anyway, the next question is for Alicia. Says, I kind of understand the coercion gap as the influence of politicians or high ranks over bureaucrats or medium ranks. That's because high ranks have to comply with that forbearance behavior. So I don't know if that could be considered as a coercion gap. Anyway, pretty impressed with your chapter and this book, and thank you so much. Blah, 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 blah. But I don't know if you want to elaborate on this, or this is a misunderstanding or not, Alicia. It's you.
Sure, well, maybe I'll just situate this in the sort of broader literature on principal agent issues, and where my chapter and some of the work in the book also follows. So I think a lot of times we think that weak enforcement comes from the behavior of street-level bureaucrats who are often accepting bribes or potentially shirking on the job and therefore aren't enforcing these laws. So that's the sort of traditional perspective where, you can imagine street vendors and squatters are paying the bureaucrats, or they simply don't have the resources to do their job. And so my chapter was really trying to reverse that. And actually a good part of the chapter is spent using more qualitative interviews with bureaucrats as well, to say there are actually many bureaucrats who don't want to enforce these laws, who have what I call a welfarist orientation, in which they're situated in their communities, they're interacting on a daily basis with people affected by these laws, and saying it's completely immoral to enforce these laws, and I'm under pressure from politicians, and some of them even quit their jobs, sort of opposing orders to enforce. Now, you can also have the opposite circumstance. I interviewed many bureaucrats who I call sort of legalists, who say, my job is to enforce the law as it's written on paper, and instead are getting pressure from politicians to not enforce the law for electoral or social reasons. And so both of those dyads exist, and I think are part of why we see variation in these patterns of forbearance and the use of coercion more broadly. But it really, in both cases, is trying to push back against a sort of simplistic view of bureaucrats as simply kind of rent-seeking or shirking, which I don't think is right. So there is a power dynamic in terms of who wants to enforce the law and who doesn't, but it's not always just simply higher ups want to enforce and bureaucrats do not.
Thanks, Alicia. This is a question, I would say, general question to the editors, probably, from Cristobal. He says, Latin America is a commodity exporter, and there's been literature about the links between the resource curse and institutional strength, many times negative. Has any of you analyzed how this affects the politics of institutional weakness? Perhaps Professor Dargent on illegal mining case. So it's about resource curse and institutions.
Eduardo, you want to go or shall I?
Okay, let me go quickly. Yes, there is a macro literature of how mining countries and commodity boom dependent countries produce the kind of economy that produces a weak state that doesn't create middle classes, and that is somehow linked to have this kind of weak state institutional linkages, weak institution state capture, no, but this pressure group. So all that literature is there, of course. But I think it's interesting also to go more to the micro level and how these dynamics make state weakness and institutional weakness to continue over time. No? How, for example, having more resources out of mining booms may produce you a local dynamic in which it is very difficult to build state capacity at the same time, because some of these actors have also been reinforced and they are more able to resist or to negotiate new terms with the state. And that thing is, I would say, a fascinating research agenda in which is more about the continuity of this institutional weakness in cases in which states can have more resources, but nonetheless they keep in these paths. No? We have worked a little about that with my colleagues Maritza Paredes, José Carlos Orihuela, and María Eugenia Ulfe in a little booklet about that. But I think there is a lot more to be done. No? It's a really fascinating question.
If I could say really quickly, one of the findings of the literature on the relationship between commodities and resources and state institutions is that there's, one, a lot of variation, and it has a lot to do with the timing of the so-called resource burst. So in cases where strong state institutions are in place prior to the sort of exogenous shock of these resources, Norway is an extreme case, Chile to some degree, state institutions can handle the boom reasonably well. In other cases, say Bolivia, or as Terry Carl has shown in Venezuela, where state institutions are weak at the time that you get an influx of resources, they're likely to be further corroded.
Yeah, I mean, I might jump in, Javier, on this. I think
Sure.
there's several chapters of the book that deal with this question. So our chapter on the kind of the conditions for weakness discussed that because Latin America, sorry, I didn't, I'm not here. Because Latin America is so dependent on natural resources, economically has much more volatility than other regions in the world. And the economic volatility fit changes in political coalitions that now have the possibility of changing the rules as Aníbal described, or changing the incentives to follow the rules. So for instance, the chapter by Paula Zafón and Juan González is on property rights in Mexico. And it shows that with the boom, the commodity boom of the end of the 19th century, a law that was not really enforced because it was only enforced private property on the church, but not on the indigenous pueblos, become enforced because now this land becomes attractive for exploitation. So the law becomes activated. It was deactivated before, it was weak, and suddenly it becomes stronger. We also have, I think, obviously the chapter by Eduardo, as he just mentioned, he shows that it might strengthen the state, but might also strengthen civil society, resistance to the state. But again, I think the chapter by Calvo and Negreto shows that this is, economic conditions and economic shocks are a crucial incentive to change the rules. So I do think that, we do have a general discussion in the conclusion of the book, but there's also specific mechanisms in some of the chapters linking natural resources with institutional weakness.
There's now a question for Mala. When is your next article coming out? No, that's part of the question, but she says, I love your chapter overview and the trends you and your co-author are uncovering and how you're putting the perceived weakness of some institutions into broader context. I wonder how you conceptualize this soft, advanced progress change then, say from a societal perspective that is also institutional in a sense, right? Or if that's how a grain or institutional strength deploys through time.
So I very much like the image of a grain that then sort of might grow over time. And that just inspires me to make just two points which may contradict the impression that I gave in my remarks, which is that in the chapter we do mention that the lack of enforcement or the weakness of all legislation is not just a matter of sort of bottom-up non-compliance in the sense of very sticky, entrenched social norms, but there's also strategic non-enforcement. I mean, Eduardo talks about standoffish states in his chapter, when the state simply, it could enforce, but it doesn't have any reason to because there are no penalties for non-enforcement. Well, at various points in Mexico as well as in Latin America, organized groups of women made it more costly for the state to keep on ignoring violations of, violence against women. They made it electorally costly, they made it embarrassing, they made it shameful. So there's also a strategic element here. It's not just, sort of a norm that slowly is taking place over time. And I just also wanted to answer the question about the weak.
Are you all having the same issue?
Yeah, that's what happens when you overstep and answer too many questions.
Yes, I will tell that to Mala when she comes back.
Yeah, I don't think.
But I think she was about to answer the question, the next question. So when she comes back, I'm gonna phrase it. I'm gonna read it for all of you. This is for all of you. If the label "weak" quotation marks to approach Latin American institutions imply that institutions in the region are second-class or less advanced institutions that should develop into strong institutions. I guess that's the normative question you guys are always ask. Mala, you're back. Sorry, Mara, you were
weak internet institutions in New Mexico. I don't know when you lost me, but I was just saying that the US has many weak institutions as well. And talking about the Civil Rights Act. Yeah, it's not just Latin America.
I'm okay. Who wants to jump in the next? This is fun to share a debate over Zoom. Who wants to jump on the week?
General one?
Can I take a shot?
Why don't you do it, Dan?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, so there are lots of ways in which the book is not suggesting that neither that all Latin American institutions are weak, nor that Latin America is the only place that has weak institutions, nor that all institutional strength is good, right? And so, for example, you know, the point of the book in some ways is that institutional weakness can be a political strategy, is intentional, right? And it's intentional because it benefits particular actors. And that means, you know, it's not an inherent kind of condition of Latin American politics, right? In fact, that's part of what we're pushing against is the idea that, well, you know, the global North has strong institutions, the global South has weak institutions, kind of like they have different climates or something, right? So we're really pushing people to think about the politics behind that. And that means almost necessarily that weakness is not uniform across all institutions in Latin America, right? In fact, you know, a couple of the chapters are about strong institutions, you know, strong property rights institutions in Mexico, strong constitutions in more modern times, right? But that doesn't mean that all strong institutions are really good either, right? Because one of the strong institutions we have in the book is an authoritarian constitution that is really constraining politics in Chile and that is causing all kinds of social strife, a failure to redistribute to the extent that the political system would probably want to redistribute in the absence of that constitution, right? And so lots of ways in which, right, the connection between both Latin America and weak institutions and bad outcomes is sort of more complicated than that. And then the other is the point that Mala was just making, which is, you know, so what I was thinking when somebody asked Mala the question about failed institutions, right? The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution is you know, an aspirational institution that seeks racial equality. You know, we're pretty far into the history of that amendment and we're still falling pretty short. And arguably it took 100 years to even begin to do something about it, right? So you know, when people say things like, well, you know, those people in Latin America shouldn't bother with institutions because they're not going to make a difference or something, you know, I say, well, there's nobody in the US who's making the argument we should have never included the 14th Amendment just because it took us this long to even begin to take it moderately seriously. And so I think, you know, it can sound sometimes, I mean, I think weak institutions in Latin America can be a problem and need to be addressed and need to be discussed, but that's a far cry from saying, you know, Latin America is just a place of failed institutions and everybody else has great institutions. So.
Just to add very quickly, the US has some good examples of strong institutions that are really problematic. The electoral is one, and I think that's likely to become even more problematic in the years ahead.
It's 5:30 and I think everybody should go. I know Steve has another event now, soon, and many others do too. So I want to thanks for inviting me. I learned a lot as a non-political scientist here. Thank you all. It's so nice seeing you. Congrats on the book. And hopefully Mala will have the carpets soon so there's no echo. For her voice.
You still have the dog.
Yes.
2 dogs, but next time we should do a book presentation with food and drinks especially, right?
Yeah, please.
The drinks are here.
But not coffee.
It's coffee,
so
right?
I wasn't referring to coffee.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Nice seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's really good to
Vicky.
see all of you.
Good to see everyone.
It's
Yeah.
great seeing
Bye.
you.
See you.
See you. Bye.